Welcome to Spooky Stories and Creepy Tales, where I, Silas Darkwood, narrate stories of horror and dread. Tonight, we're doing something a little different. I'm introducing a new series to the channel, one that follows the strange and unsettling cases of Alex Kane, a paranormal investigator haunted by his own dark past. In this tale, Alex finds himself in a nowhere town hiding from things we won't mention. For the last 2 nights, the payphone has rung at exactly 3:33 in the morning. Tonight, he answers it. Will he solve the mystery on who's on the other end? Let's find out. Dim the lights, pull up your blankets, and if your phone rings, maybe tonight it would be best to ignore it. 3:33 a.m. and the payphone was ringing. Again. Alex Kane sat in the open door of his van, bare feet dangling over cracked asphalt, a battered notebook balanced on his knee. The pen moved without stopping, had been moving for hours now, filling the pages with observations about nothing. The color of rust on the dumpster behind the diner, the way heat lightning flickered silent and pink along the horizon. Anything to keep his eyes open, anything to stay out of his own head. The solstice was 3 days away. He could feel it in his bones like a coming storm. That thinning of whatever membrane separated the world from everything pressing in against it. Sleep wasn't an option. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw things, not the usual visions of violence and death. Those he could almost handle. Other things, shapes that folded in on themselves in a way geometry shouldn't allow. Colors that didn't exist, that his brain tried desperately to translate into something familiar and failed, leaving only a searing wrongness behind his eyes. Landscapes where the horizon curved upward instead of down. Where shadows moved with purpose, or something vast and patient watched from angles the human mind wasn't built to perceive. He couldn't describe it, couldn't write it down, no matter how many pages he filled. The words just slid away, refusing to attach themselves to what he'd seen. All he could do was stay awake and hope that the solstice passed quickly, hope the membrane thickened again before whatever was pressing against it found a way through. Or found him. So he wrote, and he didn't sleep, and the payphone kept ringing. This was the 3rd night straight. The first 2 times he'd been trying to rest, and the shrill mechanical bell had dragged him from the edge of nightmares. Now he was tired and curious and too irritated to ignore it any longer. He dropped the notebook on the van's floor, not bothering with shoes. The gravel bit into his bare soles as he crossed the empty lot in angry strides. The desert cold had settled in hard after sunset, seeping through his thin t-shirt, but he barely noticed. 3 days without any real sleep had a way of making everything feel distant, like watching his own life through foggy glass. He snatched the receiver from its cradle mid-ring. "Help me, please, he's coming." A girl's voice, young, shredded with terror. Then the sound of a phone booth door slamming open, a choked scream, then nothing. Alex pressed the receiver hard against his ear. Silence. No dial tone. No static. Dead air that seemed to swallow sound rather than simply lack it. He tapped the switch hook. Once, twice, nothing. Alex hung up the phone with exaggerated care as if it might ring again the moment he let go. For a long moment he just stood there, receiver back in his cradle, listening to his own breathing in the dark. Then the reporter in him, the part that hadn't quite died along with everything else, took over. He stepped out of the booth and circled it slowly, bare feet crunching on the gravel. The structure was old, probably installed sometime in the 70s, and forgotten ever since. Paint peeling, glass cracked in 3 places, a faded out-of-order sign bleached nearly white by decades of sun. He looked up. The overhead wires ended 6 feet from the pole, severed and frayed, flapping loose in the desert wind. They'd been cut years ago, maybe decades, long enough for the copper to turn green, long enough for weeds to grow up through the concrete pad, long enough for everyone to forget this booth had ever worked at all. And yet, Alex stood there in the dark, hollow-eyed, his head buzzing on 4 hours of sleep spread across 3 days. The van beside him smelled of old coffee and the sour tang of fierce sweat, his own, from visions that came whether he wanted them or not. A dead phone, a dead line, a girl screaming for help that couldn't possibly have reached him. And yet it had. Morning came too bright and too cheerful. Alex hadn't slept, hadn't even tried. She just sat in the van watching the sky shift from black to gray to pale orange, writing nothing words in his notebook until his hand cramped. By 6, the diner across the lot had opened. The aroma of bacon grease and coffee rolled across the parking lot. His stomach twisted, unsure if he wanted food or wanted to reject the very idea of it. Food won. If he couldn't have sleep, he at least might as well not be hungry. The diner was the kind of place that existed in every small town he'd passed through. Vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a counter lined with men in seed caps who've probably been sitting in those exact spots for 30 years. A bell jingled over the door. Nobody looked up. Alex dropped into a booth near the window, positioning himself with a clear view of the parking lot. The payphone was visible from here, standing alone at the edge of the asphalt like a forgotten monument. A waitress appeared, mid-50s, gray roots showing under auburn dye, a name tag that read Darlene. She had the look of someone who'd seen everything and been surprised by none of it. "Coffee," Alex said before she could speak. She poured without asking if he wanted cream, but didn't move on. "You're the one in the van." It wasn't a question. Alex glanced out the window at his vehicle parked conspicuously in an otherwise mostly empty lot. Not much got past anyone in a town this size. "That's me." "Been out there 3 days now." Darlene set the pot down on the table, settling in for a conversation he hadn't asked for. "Most folks either pass straight through without stopping, or they start here and never leave." She nodded toward the man on the counter, sun-dried and permanent as a landscape. "You don't look broke down. Not your vehicle, anyway." "Just need a place to stop for a while." "Uh-huh." Darlene studied him with the casual assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading strangers. Whatever she saw made her mouth tighten slightly. "You don't look like you've slept in a week, hon." 3 days, but close." He wrapped his hands around the mug, absorbing the heat. "That payphone out there, what's the story?" Her eyebrows rose. "The calls wake you up?" 3 nights running." "Huh." She picked up the pot and refilled his cup, even though he'd barely touched it, an excuse to linger. "It's been doing that since I was 12 years old, maybe longer. Folks around here just ignore it now." "Who's calling?" Darlene shrugged, but something flickered in behind her eyes. "Story goes, some girl got murdered out there way back, before my time. Phone's been dead longer than she has, but it still rings." She said it casually, the way people talk about other local legends they didn't quite believe, but don't quite dismiss either. "Every few years somebody new comes through, hears the ringing, asks questions. I always tell them the same thing. Let it alone. Nothing good comes from picking at old scabs." "Anyone ever answer it?" "Couple times. Truckers mostly. They hear a girl screaming, then nothing. One guy said she asked him for help." Darlene's mouth twisted. "He let out of here that same night. Never saw him again." Alex sipped his coffee. It was burnt and bitter. He reached for packets of sweetener. "She have a name? The girl?" He flipped through the colorful packets, but none were the white ones that would have made the coffee drinkable. "Not that I ever heard. Just a story, you know. The kind people tell to scare teenagers away from making out in parked cars." She pulled out her order pad. "You want food or just coffee?" Alex picked up the laminated menu, scanning past the platters and combos to the bottom corner where the prices dropped. Senior menu. Eggs, bacon, toast. $4.99. "Eggs and bacon off the senior menu." Scrambled. Darlene's eyes flickered from the menu to his face, one eyebrow rising. He wasn't fooling anyone. "I feel old enough," he said. The eggs sat in his stomach like stones. The coffee had gone cold, and Alex was staring at the booth. He knew what he had to do. Knew it the way he knew the sun would set and the phone would ring again tonight, and the solstice would keep pressing against the world like a hand against a locked door. Some things demanded answers. Some things demanded action. He hated both. By noon, the temperature had climbed past tolerable. He retreated to his van, cracked all the windows, and lay on the bare mattress and back, watching heat shimmer off the asphalt through the windshield. His body ached for sleep. His mind wouldn't allow it. At 2:15, he gave up. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his messenger bag, the old leather one that held his laptop and the journal he never let out of his sight, and he walked back across the lot. The phone booth seemed smaller in daylight, more pathetic, paint peeling, glass cracked. Receiver hanging slightly crooked on its hook. Alex circled it, once, twice. Noticed details. Scratched initials near the base, TM plus RH, 1987. A sticker for a band he'd never heard of, half scraped away. Cigarette burns on the metal shelf where the phone book should have been. He stopped at the door, took a breath, and looked at the ground. His shadow stretched behind him, long and thin in the afternoon sun. It shifted, caught up with him, sliding back into place beneath his feet like it had been running late. Well, Alex muttered, that's new. He'd stopped being surprised by the impossible somewhere around month 3. Now it was just normal. The way clocks ran wrong sometimes, the visions, the way his reflections sometimes showed him things that hadn't happened yet. He opened the door and stepped inside. The booth smelled of rust and old urine and something else, something faintly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Alex pressed his palm flat against the phone's metal housing, cool despite the heat, and opened the door in his head he usually kept bolted shut. The vision hit him like a fist to the temple. 17, denim jacket with patches sewn on the sleeves. A rose, a peace sign, something that might have been a band logo. Mascara streaking down her cheeks in black rivers. She's pounding on the glass with both fists. The sound is wrong, like beating against a coffin lid. Mom, anybody, please, he's coming back. Her breath fogs the receiver as she screams into it. Cord is wrapped around her wrist so tight it's cutting off circulation, her fingers going white. She turns. She sees him, Alex, standing inside the memory with her. For a moment, confusion breaks through the terror. Her mouth opens, but no words come out. Just that look, the one that asks 1,000 questions she doesn't have time to voice. The ancient exhaustion in her eyes is worse than the fear, decades of replaying this moment night after night, ringing a dead phone, begging for someone to answer. Please, she whispers, please set me free. I just want to stop. I just want to go home. Behind her, the booth door rips open. A shape, broad shoulders, work boots, a face Alex can't quite see reaches in, hands twist in her hair. She screams, not in fear this time, but in despair, the sound of someone who knows help isn't coming, has never been coming, will never come. Please. Vision shattered. Alex found himself on his knees in the gravel, palms scraped raw where he'd caught himself falling. Blood dripped from his nose, spotting the pale stones beneath him. The world tilted, steadied, tilted again. He crawled to the edge of the lot, stomach heaving, bile rising in his throat. He fought it back. Those eggs hadn't been amazing, but they'd also been $4.99 he couldn't afford to lose. He swallowed hard, once, twice, until the nausea retreated to a dull ache behind his eyes. When he could stand, he made his way back to the van on legs that felt like they were made of rubber. The heat inside was suffocating, but he didn't care. He collapsed on the mattress and pressed his forearm over his eyes and tried not to see her face. He must have slept because he woke to darkness and disorientation. His shirt soaked through with sweat. The dashboard clock read 7:48. Outside, the sky had gone purple and orange, the sun dropping behind distant hills. He sat up too fast and had to wait for dizziness to pass. She needed help. She'd been asking for help for God knew how many years, decades probably. The waitress timeline was right. And nobody was able to hear her. Nobody except the occasional trucker who heard a scream and ran away. Alex Kane wasn't going to run. But he needed to know more, needed to understand what he was dealing with. If there was anything to understand. He pulled out his phone. No signal, of course. Town probably didn't have a cell tower within 50 miles. Which meant the library, if the backwater had one. Did. A squat brick building 2 blocks off the main road, open until 9 p.m. according to the faded sign out front. A miracle of small-town stubbornness. The librarian was a white-haired woman who looked at Alex's disheveled appearance with undisguised suspicion, but pointed him toward the local history section without comment. The newspaper archives were on microfiche. Actual microfiche, like something out of a museum, a machine took him 10 minutes to figure out. He searched for an hour. Murder, phone booth, missing girl, 1970s, 1980s, year by year, scanned by a headline, eyes burning from the glowing screen. Nothing. No articles about a girl killed at a phone booth, no missing person reports that matched. No mention of the booth at all, except for a 1992 notice about the phone company removing service from unused rural installations. She was a nobody, a ghost without a name, without a history. without even the dignity of being remembered as a victim. Alex sat back in his chair and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. I just want to go home. He didn't know any rituals, didn't know any spells. The book in his bag, the one he never opened, the one that had started all of this, probably contained 100 ways to deal with unquiet spirits, but he wasn't going to touch it, wasn't going to risk letting more of that knowledge into the world. Which meant he had to improvise. Fire. Fire had worked before. On a house in Oregon that wouldn't stop bleeding. On a chair in Nevada where a man had died screaming. Fire cleansed. Fire released. Fire was the oldest human magic, older than words. He left the library and drove until he found what he needed. There was a lot behind the boarded-up hardware store on the far side of town. A few vehicles were there, dusty and forgotten. One of them, an old Ford pickup truck with flat tires and a cracked windshield, looked like it hadn't moved in months, maybe years. Alex pulled his van up alongside it and killed the engine. His hands shook as he pulled the empty gas can from the back of his van. This was real theft, real actual theft, the kind that could get him arrested, get him put into a system where people asked questions about who he was and where they came from. He couldn't afford that, couldn't afford to be noticed, to be remembered, to leave a trail. But she couldn't afford another night of screaming into a dead phone. He worked fast, crouching in the shadows, fitting the siphon hose into the tank with fingers that fumbled twice before hitting the right angle. The gasoline smell hit him hard, bringing tears to his eyes. Luckily, there was enough in the Hulk to fill the 2-gallon gas can. He was done and back in his van within 3 minutes. No one shouted, no alarms went off. When he pulled out of the lot, his heart was hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. The diner was dark when he got back, last employee's taillights disappearing down the road. The payphone stood alone in the empty lot, a dark rectangle against the stars. Alex sat in his van for a long moment, watching it, waiting for, what? A sign? Permission? Neither was coming. He grabbed the gas can and walked. The booth's door creaked when he opened it. Inside, the smell was the same. Rust, old urine, that faint sweetness of decay. He could almost feel her presence hovering just outside the edge of perception, waiting. I don't know your name, Alex said quietly. The words felt foolish, speaking to empty air, but he kept going. I don't know who you were, or who hurt you, or why nobody remembers, but you asked for help, and I heard you. He stepped back and began circling the booth, splashing gasoline against the metal frame. Liquid caught the starlight, glistening like dark water. I don't know any prayers, he continued. I don't know any spells. I don't even know if this is the right thing to do, but I think fire is older than whatever's keeping you here, and I think maybe it can set you free. He finished the circle. The smell of gas was overwhelming now, thick and acrid in the back of his throat. So, he pulled the road flare from his jacket, cracked it to life. This is me, doing what I can. This is me saying you don't have to answer that phone anymore. You don't have to scream for help that never came. He tossed the flare to the gasoline-soaked frame. Go home. The fire caught with a soft whoomp, racing around the booth in a perfect ring before climbing upward. Within seconds, the whole structure was burning, flames licking toward the sky, metal groaning as heat warped it from true. Alex stood back, the fire's heat stinging his face. Through the flames, a shape took form. It coalesced, gathered from the smoke and heat into something almost solid. A girl, 17, 70s denim jacket. No blood this time, no tears, no fear. She looked at him through the fire, and her eyes were clear for the first time. Not ancient, not exhausted, just young. Just a girl who'd been stuck for far too long and was finally free. She smiled. Small. Tired. Kind of smile that says thank you and goodbye, and I'm so tired all at once. Then she scattered upward into sparks that rose like reverse rain toward the stars, like something finally allowed to let go. Alex stood there watching the flames consume that relic of the past. He didn't know who she was, would never know. But for one moment, in that smile, he'd seen something that looked almost like peace, almost like happiness. Sirens wailed somewhere far off, breaking the spell. Someone had seen the flames. Of course they had. A fire of this size in the middle of nowhere. It was probably visible for miles. Time to go. Alex tossed the empty gas can in the back of his van, climbed behind the wheel, and rolled out of town, headed west. California was a long way off, but the roads were empty and the night was clear, and for once, just this once, he thought he might be able to sleep when he finally stopped. He checked the rearview mirror. The desert sky glowed red behind him, part sunset, part funeral pyre. He picked up the coffee cup from the holder, swirled it twice out of habit, took a sip. Cold, bitter. He drank it anyway. The girl's smile stayed with him as the miles rolled by. Such a small thing, really. A moment of peace at the end of decades of suffering. It wasn't much, wasn't enough, but it was something. Maybe that was all anyone could hope for. Small moments of something good scattered like sparks against the darkness. Not for him, probably. He'd made his peace with that a long time ago. But for her, for that nameless girl who'd finally stopped screaming, maybe there was still some tiny bit of happiness left in the world. The road stretched west into the darkness, and Alex Kane drove on. Well, dear listener, that was our first glimpse into the world of Alex Kane, a man who cannot look away from the darkness, no matter how much it costs him. He gave a nameless girl something no one else could. Someone who answered. What would you have done? Would you have picked up that phone? If you want to hear more of Alex Kane, head over to bluecoffeepublishing.com, where you can read additional free case files from the series and discover the full-length novel Redwood Killer, which is the first book in the Alex Kane series. Post a comment and let me know what you thought of this story, and if you want to hear more. Till next time, dear listeners, stay spooky, and remember, I'll be haunting your feed again soon.